America finds itself on the brink of social and economic collapse. For the first time in decades, political violence in our streets has become routine. Acts of domestic terrorism are on the rise, and prominent figures in the public and private sectors are the target of vigilante assassination attempts. At the same time, wealth inequality is at the highest point in over a century, exceeding even the Gilded Age of the late 1800s, and has left millions of young people unable to start a family or escape the ever-growing and untenable burden of permanent debt slavery. Meanwhile, the pampered and protected Epstein class grow ever more blatant in their flaunting of the public will, as they wage unconstitutional wars, bankrupt us with unprecedented money printing, and absolve themselves of all accountability. There is no voting our way out of this situation. Nobody is coming to save us. The only question is this: will we continue to tolerate the corruption and degeneracy before us, or are we finally on the brink of the next American Revolution? And the answer is, Jesus tap dancing Christ, I sure fucking hope so. Now let me be clear. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I do not condone violence against the political elite or the upper classes. I think that violence is only morally or legally acceptable when they do it to us, in the form of mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders, or sending us all to die in a war that nobody fucking asked for, or putting microplastics in our balls. But let's be real here. No matter what your political affiliation is, whether you prefer to be reamed by a blue dildo or a red dildo, I don't judge, whatever tickles your pickle. How many of you can honestly say that you wouldn't be thrilled to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that Trump, Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell, and the rest of their satanic, Zionist, geriatric, pedophile, adrenochrome-sucking friends were out of a job and on their way to Guantanamo? There was this viral meme a few months back where Pam Bondi allegedly said that if the Epstein client list were to be prosecuted, the entirety of Western civilization would collapse in on itself. And she never said this, mind. It was a fake quote, but I still think it's pretty telling that the response to this idea was overwhelming enthusiastic approval. And why shouldn't we, the common people, pray for the collapse or overthrow of a system that no longer serves our best interest, and in fact actively works against our best interest at every possible opportunity? I think at this point it's safe to say that total systemic collapse is the only hope that most of us have to ever afford a home or finally pay off our buy now, pay later burrito debt. Let me put it to you this way. You might look at January 6th, which, by the way, was the most impotent, flaccid, wet fart of an insurrection in the history of insurrections, and you might be disappointed in it because a bunch of dingbats tried to overthrow the federal government. But I'm disappointed in it because they didn't even come close. We are not the same. And I bet that you would feel differently about January 6th if those dingbats were storming the Capitol over the Epstein files, or housing affordability, or the merciless brutality against children in the Middle East that your taxes are currently subsidizing. So sure, the people who stormed the Capitol were probably misguided in their motivations, but I think that their belief that the current hegemonic power structure in this country is intractably corrupt is something I think we can all resonate with at this point. Which is why when people try to fearmonger me about Antifa or the Proud Boys or some other insurrectionist domestic terrorist organization and the idea that they might violently overthrow the government, my reaction is something like,
"Oh, that's terrible."
You seem kind of psyched.
No, I'm bummed.
Honestly, this whole we're on the brink of civil war or revolution thing is getting to be sort of a tease. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy edging as much as the next guy, but there's only so much edging a man can take. And this leads me to ask certain uncomfortable questions. Questions like, are we actually close to some kind of a violent insurrection as the FBI would have us believe? And also, what are these social, political, and economic conditions that have led to violent revolutions in the past? And also, if I pray hard enough, do you think it'll turn out that Bibi Netanyahu is actually dead? And again, I am not advocating for political violence or violence of any kind. I'm just putting forth the observation that from a historical perspective, revolutions have been fought for far less than what we're dealing with right now, and that we meet a lot of the prerequisite criteria that would typically precipitate some kind of massive political upheaval. And I think it's a little weird that it hasn't happened already? What kind of criteria? Well, I'm glad you asked, hypothetical internet stranger. To get a better sense of where we are today in terms of our socio-political unrest, it would be helpful to compare us to another point in history. On principle, I am not going to talk about either the Weimar Republic or the Roman Empire because those have been done to absolute fucking death.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay?
But thankfully, there was a point in recent American history, within living memory even, where there seemed to be a lot of momentum behind the idea of a violent revolutionary overthrow of the federal government. I'm talking, of course, about the days of rage bombings of the early 1970s. According to official FBI statistics, in a single 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, there were approximately 2,500 domestic bombings or attempted bombings on American soil. That is an average of 5 bombings per day for nearly a year and a half, targeting police stations, banks, corporate offices, even the U.S. Capitol and the Pentagon.
At 1 minute before 1 o'clock this morning, the switchboard at the Capitol received a phone call. A man's voice said a bomb would go off in the building in half an hour. At 1:30 in the morning, it did.
These bombings were carried out by a variety of different anti-establishment groups to include the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, the Symbionese Liberation Army, the FALN, and others. To emphasize, this was not a centralized, singular, organized campaign. This was largely decentralized and organic and perpetuated by individual groups of people across the country. Each group had their stated motivations, many of which overlapped along the lines of protesting the Vietnam War, combating racism, or inspiring an outright revolutionary overthrow of the U.S. government. So while there was ideological overlap between many of these groups, they operated independently for the most part. Perhaps the most remarkable fact about these bombings is that they had an incredibly low rate of injury or fatality. Fewer than 1% of these 2,500 bombings in 71 and 72 resulted in any fatalities. And this is because most of the groups, especially the Weather Underground, would go out of their way to call in advance warnings to give people a chance to evacuate or time the blast for late at night when the buildings would be empty. These bombings were so frequent that they became a ubiquitous part of life in America, leading to public desensitization. So let's use this very specific campaign of domestic terrorism as a baseline for comparison for where we are today. What elements that contributed to the amount of social and political unrest then do we see now? Number 1, unpopular wars. This one is perhaps the most obvious point of comparison. It's kind of hard to think about the 60s and 70s without thinking about the Vietnam War. To say that it was a motivation behind the bombings of the late 60s and early 70s would be an understatement. Of the 2.7 million veterans who served in Vietnam, over 800,000 came home with service-connected disabilities. We're talking hundreds of thousands of young men coming home disfigured, exposed to Agent Orange, suffering from PTSD, many of whom received little to nothing in the way of proper care. Now, there is a clear difference between Vietnam and the conflicts that we find ourselves in today, in particular, Ukraine, Iran, and Palestine. If nothing else, certainly in terms of boots on the ground presence of American troops. As stupid as this administration is, I really doubt that anyone sincerely thinks that a draft would have a snowball's chance in hell. But hey, anything could happen, right? At least at this moment, American troops are not being injured or killed, certainly not at the rates that they were back in Vietnam. However, much like the war in Vietnam, a big part of the reason why the wars today are so unpopular is because of how heavily televised they are. We can see in vivid detail the women and children being massacred with our tax dollars. And it's obvious that this unprecedented level of transparency is having a measurable impact on public sentiment towards the federal government, as well as certain Middle Eastern countries. Also, it's hard to swallow the lie that our taxes can't go towards things like healthcare or housing or infrastructure when we can afford to print money into oblivion for endless warfare. Which brings us to our next point of comparison. Number 2, wealth inequality. One of the craziest things about this historical comparison is that the 70s were the tail end of the most economically prosperous and equitable period in American history. The young adults who were doing these bombings in the early 70s were actually the younger half of the baby boomer generation. Yes, the same baby boomers who just jacked up the rent in your 800 square foot rental house for the third month in a row and who keep voting Zionist war criminals into Congress are the same ones who quite literally bombed the US Capitol back in the day in an attempt to dismantle imperialist capitalism. Which is especially ironic considering that they are the primary beneficiaries of the insane wealth concentration I mentioned earlier in the video, which again is higher than any point in the last century. Now, one would think that a point of relative economic prosperity, like back then, would be more peaceful than a time of extreme wealth inequality like today. One way to interpret this is that these young kids, these upstarts back in the 70s, were operating from a very privileged position economically, and they knew that they could afford to take risks that would be near impossible for anybody today because they had a much larger social safety net to fall back on. This certainly isn't true for all of the would-be revolutionaries, but especially the white college student demographic, which was disproportionately represented in these groups. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people today who are so far in debt, and the hope of ever getting out of it and starting a life or buying a home or having a family is so far out of reach that they're practically guaranteed to be stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder for the rest of their lives if nothing changes. In other words, an entire generation of people with very little to lose. Speaking of which, number 3, disaffected young men. Of the 27 million American men who were draft eligible during the war, a little under 10% of them served in Vietnam. And of the 58,000 young men killed during the conflict, over 60% of them were under the age of 21. Which means that at the time, unless you were living under a rock, you had a very real chance of personally knowing a young man, maybe even a teenager, who served in that conflict, and who were left with permanent physical or psychological scars as a result. We're talking about a significant percentage of an entire generation of young men. Now, the harms being inflicted on young men today may not be so much physical in nature, but they are certainly psychological in nature, and they affect a much larger proportion of this generation. To take but one example, roughly 70% of American men under the age of 30 at the prime age to start a family and have children are unable to qualify for a mortgage, which means that the overwhelming majority of an entire generation of men today are locked out of the basic markers of adult life. A home represents financial stability, generational wealth, the ability to start a family, and the promise that hard work will lead to a better future for their children. Is it any wonder that nearly 40,000 young American men commit suicide each year? Compare that number to the 58,000 men who died in Vietnam over the course of 20 years. Now, you might be asking yourself, why am I focusing on young men specifically? Doesn't wealth inequality affect both men and women of this generation? Yes, definitely so. However, when large numbers of young men within a society are disenfranchised, it can have uniquely outsized impacts on the well-being and function of that society. Valerie Hudson refers to this phenomena as the surplus male hypothesis in her 2004 book, Bare Branches. She observes that in China and India, due to systemic discrimination against females and deeply rooted cultural preferences for having male children, there are now far more men than women. Enough so that approximately 1 in 6 adult men in those countries are basically permanently locked out of the marriage pool, which is really not great for the health of a society. Now, I need everyone to hold on to their butts real quick because I'm about to say something really offensive. Okay? You ready? Males and females are different. I know, I was shocked when I found out too. Very upsetting stuff. And in particular, males, on average, are statistically more disagreeable than females. Disagreeableness is a scientific term related to the Big Five personality test and is basically a measure of how likely someone is to engage in confrontation or competition, which in practical terms means that men are more likely than women to engage in criminal activity, commit violent acts, or join disruptive anti-establishment movements like the Weather Underground and bomb courthouses. Especially if those young men do not have wives or children, which would give them some level of investment in maintaining a stable, healthy society instead of just flipping over the Monopoly board and starting over from scratch. As much as Hollywood would like for you to believe that violent revolution is a primarily female enterprise, history does not bear this out, and neither does basic biology. Therefore, A society with a disproportionately large amount of disaffected young men unable to start a family is generally really, really very bad for that society. And one should expect to see a disproportionate amount of violence manifested within that society. The only real question is, against whom? Number 4, an appetite for violence. Even excluding the bombing campaigns, the late 60s and early 70s were defined by intense political turmoil, violence, and class warfare. One notable example is the deliberate assassination campaign carried out by the Black Liberation Army that killed 13 New York police officers, or the infamous France's Tavern bombing by FALN, which killed 4 and injured more than 50 people. To quote Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, who was later assassinated in his bed by the Chicago Police Department, "We say it's no longer a question of violence or non-violence. We say it's a question of resistance to fascism or non-existence within fascism." So allow me to disabuse you of the notion that the 60s and 70s were all about, free love and smoking pot and Woodstock and LSD. No, people were getting killed. Now, to bring it into the present moment, what evidence do we have that there is an appetite for violence against the wealthy and powerful? I feel like we still do not fully appreciate as a culture the significance of the killing of Brian Thompson and the subsequent hero worship of Luigi Mangione. Before that fateful day, I feel like many of us harbored contempt for the healthcare industry and recognized it as predatory or even outright evil in many cases. And maybe some people, especially those who had been victimized by that industry, fantasized about some kind of a violent retribution against the people within it that were perpetuating it. But I think that none of us could have anticipated the amount of public celebration that took place after the assassination of Brian Thompson, and the level of contempt and hatred for people in positions of power that celebration indicated rests just below the surface of American society. Now, you could make the argument that this is a special case because of how especially evil the healthcare industry is and the kinds of personal connections that people have to it, but I really don't think so. I would bet good money that if we were to see another public execution of some other billionaire or CEO in some other industry, that you would see very few people mourning that loss right now. And you'd probably see more than just a few people celebrating. Unfortunately, there's only really one way to test this theory, and it's not something that I am willing to advocate for. And you might say, well, but Brian Thompson wasn't a political assassination, so is it really fair to compare his killing to the assassination of prominent figures in the 60s and 70s? But there, I would disagree with you. I think that this absolutely was a political killing. In a late-stage capitalist society, which we are in at the moment, with regulatory capture so pervasive that private corporations basically write the legislation that governs them, I think that the distinction between corporate power and state power is basically just cosmetic at this point. I'm not arguing that Luigi Mangione represents the second coming of the Weather Underground. I'm arguing that the public response to Luigi Mangione is a symptom of a fever within our society. And the only prescription for that fever, apparently, are public executions. So I think that we can clearly see that a lot of the factors that contributed to social unrest and domestic terrorism in the 60s and 70s exist today. And in many cases, they're as bad, if not worse. And yet we do not see a comparable elevation of violence and civil disobedience. Sure, we see some amount of social and political unrest. We see some amount of people opposing government action that they disagree with. But do we see anything that compares to 5 bombings per day for 18 months straight? I think not. I think not even close. And in fact, political violence has decreased over the last 5 years, coinciding with a general decrease in violent homicides during the same period of time. According to the Cato Institute, between 2020 and 2025, there were only 79 people killed across the country for politically motivated reasons, or a little over 15 per year, which means you're about 20 times more likely to be killed as the result of road rage as you are of politically motivated violence. So how do we account for this relative pacifism, even in the face of far more severe corruption and degradation of our institutions? Well, I don't think that there's a single cause, but I do think that there are a number of comorbid factors that are contributing to it. Let's go through them in no particular order. Number one, historical amnesia. The United States has a very rich tradition of civil disobedience and political violence, reaching much, much further back than the 1970s, even back to the founding of the country. And I believe that we, specifically my generation and younger, have been the subject of a very deliberate and very gradual social conditioning campaign to cause us to forget about this heritage. This one is insidious because it's hard to point to any specific action taken. It's more an absence, a void of education related to political violence and political uprisings in our country's past, and the reinforcement of the idea that political violence is always wrong and can never be justified under any circumstances. To illustrate this, just as an anecdote, I recently attended a philosophy club meeting at a local college, and the topic was political violence. Very open-ended discussion, what qualifies as political violence, when might it be ethically justified, that kind of thing. And I brought up the bombings that we've been talking about in this video, specifically the 2,500 bombings within an 18-month period from 71 to 72. And not only had nobody in this group of people heard about these bombings, but many of them were outright dubious about it until somebody pulled it up on their phone and said, oh no, yeah, that's legit. Now granted, it's a pretty small sample size, but we're talking about 20-odd college students, many of whom I presume are studying American history, all of which are at least tangentially interested in the idea of political violence as a concept. And apparently, not a one of them had ever been told about this bombing campaign in the 70s. Now, I'm not picking on these folks in particular. They're lovely people. I'm friends with a few of them at this point. I'm just using this to illustrate a point. I think there's a reason that we are taught about Martin Luther King Jr. and not Malcolm X. I think there's a reason that we think about the 70s, we think about hippies and free love and Woodstock and That 70s Show and Cheech and Chong, and not about 2,500 domestic bombings within an 18-month period. Ask yourself, before you watch this video, did you know about this bombing campaign? And if so, did you learn about it in school? Or did you find out about it on your own? We have forgotten about our heritage of civil disobedience because we've not been taught. Because it is not in the interests of the people who maintain the status quo for us to realize that we might have the capacity to change it. To quote Assata Shakur, the schools we go to are reflections of the society that created them. No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that knowledge will help set you free. This video is my own small contribution to try to rectify this absence in our education. Number two, the pacification of young men. Now, I think this one is going to be a little more controversial, so just bear with me, okay? For basically my entire life, I have personally witnessed another very deliberate social engineering campaign against the idea of traditional masculinity, to the extent that we have even rebranded it as toxic masculinity. Male-specific behavior that was considered completely normal for hundreds of thousands of years, things like aggression, competition, the overt expression of sexual or romantic interest towards women, a propensity towards violence, or the defiance of social norms generally. These things are to be discouraged, vilified even. Instead, men have been told that the only narrow range of socially acceptable expressions of masculinity are passivity, deference, compliance, cooperation. Basically just being a harmless little bean. And we've been told that any men who don't fit that very narrow mold are regressive Neanderthals and should be excommunicated from polite society. Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not going Andrew Tate here, and there are aspects of traditional masculine behavior which we are better off without. Things like criminal violence or sexual assault are not generally conducive to a healthy and functioning society. However, I think we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater a bit. We need to recognize that there is most definitely going to be a trade-off involved in pacifying the more disagreeable half of your entire population. Because sometimes being disagreeable or confrontational is the appropriate response. Like, say, hypothetically, if your country were being ruled over by a bunch of Zionist, pedophile, war crime committing oligarchs who aren't playing by the rules. By pacifying men, we have deliberately and systematically handicapped the primary driving force behind the overwhelming majority of violent revolutionary actions throughout history. Turning men into nonviolent little beings absolutely serves the interests of maintaining the status quo, because it significantly decreases the likelihood of political violence taken against the state or corporate entities, which, again, I do not advocate for. Just to be perfectly clear, YouTube. Thank you. The idea of men being pacified is a big topic, and I'm not going to do justice within the context of this video. Maybe I'll do an entire video on it at some point. But to be perfectly clear, I'm not apologizing for male-specific misbehavior. I'm not saying that, sexual assault is okay. I'm just saying that it is generally better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And right now, we are in a class war. Number 3, it's easier to be nonviolent with bombs than it is with guns. One of the craziest things about the bombings of the late 60s and early 70s is that many of the attacks, including those by the Weather Underground, the FALN, and the UFF, were conducted using commercially available sticks of dynamite. This is because before 1970, there was no federal licensing system for commercial explosives whatsoever. And in fact, much of the regulatory architecture we have today was established in response to the bombings of the late 60s. Before that, you could just walk into a mining supply store and buy sticks of dynamite, blasting caps, timing devices. No registration, no permit, no background checks. Basically as easy as buying a box of nails from Home Depot is today. Guys, we used to be a proper country. What happened to us? We need to go back. I want to be able to buy a stick of dynamite from a vending machine at my local gas station. These readily available commercial explosives is why the bombing campaigns of the 60s and 70s had such a low rate of fatality. Because the primary purpose of these bombings was to bring attention to social or political issues through the destruction of property. And with explosives, this can be done remotely, late at night, and far away from populated areas. And I hear what you're saying. Well, sure, we don't have access to explosives anymore, but you know what we do have access to?
Guns. Lots of guns.
Hell yeah, baby. We have so many guns in this country. We have more guns than people in this country. Hell, I used to have a lot of guns before I lost them in a tragic boating accident. Unfortunately for any would-be revolutionaries today, it is much harder to be nonviolent with a gun than it is with a stick of dynamite. You can't really blow up an empty building or damage infrastructure with a gun. They're basically only good for killing people. And killing people is just not a great way to garner sympathy for your pet cause, especially if nobody can agree on who the enemy is. Number 4, nobody can agree on who the enemy is. In the 60s and 70s, the battle lines were pretty clearly drawn, and the enemy of our would-be revolutionaries was the United States federal government and the system of imperialist fascist crony capitalism that fed its machinations. They were the ones engaged in the Vietnam War, perpetuating systemic racism, police brutality, etc. So even though there were strong disagreements about, say, violent versus nonviolent methods of civil disobedience, or what would happen after the inevitable collapse of the existing hegemony, everyone knew who the enemy was. But today, I think it is much harder for us to clearly identify who is to blame for our specific grievances. Whose fault is it, just for example, that I can't afford a house right now? Is it the Federal Reserve printing money like there's no tomorrow? Is it the boomers hoarding rental houses? Is it private equity, whatever that shit is? I think that it's a lot harder to fight a faceless corporate entity or an entire demographic of people than it is a singular, monolithic, hegemonic power structure like the federal government. This also touches on our complete inability as a society to make sense of reality and have a shared understanding of it. The internet has completely broken this, and AI is just making it worse. I mean, we can't even agree on whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu is alive right now, and this technology is still extremely young. Because our ability to come to a shared understanding of reality is so badly compromised, it makes collective action, which is already really difficult, that much harder to coordinate. And frankly, I have no idea what the solution to that might be. All signs seem to indicate that it's going to get worse rather than better. In conclusion, I can't emphasize enough that I am not holding up the bombings of the 60s and 70s as something that should be emulated. And in fact, I would make the argument that they were largely completely counterproductive in terms of accomplishing the social or political changes that they were intended to, especially because they precipitated a massive expansion of state power to include the creation of the first federal counterterrorism forces such as the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force. To quote Mark Rudd, a prominent leader of Weather Underground, in his memoir, much of what the Weathermen did had the opposite effect of what we intended. We isolated ourselves from our friends and allies as we helped split the larger anti-war movement along the issue of violence. In general, we played into the hands of the FBI, our sworn enemies. We might as well have been on their payroll. So I think we probably shouldn't worry too much about a violent insurrection or military takeover of the federal government, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. We're certainly not voting our way out of this situation, but we're probably not bombing our way out of it either. It is worth noting that the tensions of 1971 and 1972 didn't just emerge from nowhere. This was the culmination of escalating unrest throughout the 1960s. The 1968 Democratic Convention riots, the Kent State killings in 1970, these bombings were the final act of a decade-long buildup in pressure, which, if we agree that history doesn't repeat but it rhymes, means that that buildup of tension is probably where we are right now. So even if it isn't effective, and even if it doesn't improve anything, we probably do have more political violence in our future to look forward to. I guess we'll find out together. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. You're a very cool person. Appreciate you very much. We'll see you in the next one.